So you'll remember that we've started a new part of the class where we're actually trying to develop an economic theory that's going to help us, among other things, understand the business cycle, understand how it is that macroeconomists tend to think about the business cycle, and that was a theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We started off last week by talking about aggregate supply, and we saw that it appears that how much goods and services are produced depends in some way on the time frame that we have in mind. So to review, where we ended last class was with the idea that, first of all, there should be some relationship between real GDP produced and the price level, and that if we look at this relationship over a sufficiently long time frame, what we end up with is that the long-run aggregate supply curve is shaped like this. In other words, over a sufficiently long time frame, output does not depend on the price level. And we discussed that this level is typically referred to as potential GDP. So, whenever we come up with a relationship like this, we need to ask ourselves two questions. One was, what is its shape? We already went over that. And the rationale was, over a sufficiently long time frame, prices adjust so that the relative benefit of some good or service compared to another is equal to the price of that good or service relative to another, whether it's an input or an output. And if we take those relationships and multiply all the relevant prices by any number, we're still going to end up with those exact same relationships and choices. So in the long run, how high or how low the prices are doesn't actually matter. Second thing we need to think about is what kinds of factors might shift this line. And so anything that has to do with the price level that affects supply is already embodied in its shape. So the things that might shift real GDP must be things other than the price level that affect, in this case, potential GDP. What are those things? So asking the question, what shifts potential GDP, is the same thing as asking what shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve. And I think we mentioned this last week, but remember how when we were talking about how real GDP changes over time, what we had was that GDP grows at sometimes a bit faster, sometimes a bit slower, but we can trace through it this line that represents long-run economic growth. It is convenient to identify this long-run growth trend as being, or as representing, potential GDP, around which the economy fluctuates. So, if we do that, then the answer to what shifts potential GDP just pops right out. It's whatever it is that's behind this long-run growth trend. And you'll remember what that is, because remember we discussed this. We discussed the determinants of long-run economic growth in the context of the production function. So what shifts potential GDP? Well, increases in, or changes, I guess, more broadly, because it could be up or down. Changes in capital stock, changes in labor, changes in resources more generally. and of course, changes in the efficiency with which these inputs are used, which is ultimately due to all the various things that we put under the umbrella of technology. Now, of course, economic growth is generally slow. At the per capita level, it tends to happen on average around 2% per year or something like that. So when we're trying to understand the determinants of the business cycle, very often we just ignore the fact that in reality potential GDP is slowly crawling over here to your right at about 2% per year. And just try and study, again, the fluctuations around the blue line, the fluctuations around potential GDP. This kind of abstract remittance, just imagine that this number is fixed. Okay? In reality, we know it's slowly crawling off to the right. Any questions or comments about the long run aggregate supply before we talk about the short run? There is one thing that I think is worth pointing out. Sometimes it may be tempting to think that the fluctuations around the blue line, well, it's the business cycle. People generally don't like the uncertainty involved in the business cycle. And so one of the key things that we'll discuss later on is were there any ways that the government, or maybe the Fed, can manage the economy in such a manner as to minimize these fluctuations and get rid of that uncertainty. In particular, whenever the economy is growing slowly, we know lots of people are being thrown out of work, and really all the people involved don't want that, and everyone else doesn't want to face that risk. But it's tempting to then, from there, conclude that the blue line is, in some sense, ideal, I guess. And while it's true that getting rid of the fluctuations in GDP around the blue line is an important policy goal that we'll discuss soon, it isn't necessarily true that the blue line is in some sense ideal. It's just that we don't want to, it's just that we don't like the uncertainty. The blue line itself may have issues. What do I mean by this? Remember when we discussed economic growth, we discussed that there's this tension between having some incentives for innovators to engage in pursuing technological progress versus short-run economic efficiency, because you may have to give them some sort of temporary monopoly. You know, monopolies, at least in the short run, are inefficient. So, in addition, remember when we were talking about economic growth, we spent a little time discussing how we live in a world where there are many externalities. There are positive externalities, like when new knowledge is generated, and everyone benefits, not just the person who came up with it. But then there are negative externalities, such as pollution. So all of that stuff is still going on, whether we're on the smooth blue line or whether we're on the fluctuating black line. So there are policy goals beyond just trying to smooth things out that might be important for governments or the Fed to consider. But they just would not be related to the business cycle per se. They're more related to sort of deep problems that are kind of there all the time. Lack of competition, or again, lack of incentives for technical problems, or excessive pollution of different kinds. Okay? So the blue line is better in the sense that there's no uncertainty, but it doesn't mean that there are no issues with the blue line too. Great. So with that done, we can then switch and talk about the short-run aggregate supply. So to motivate that, remember that when we were trying to figure out how is it that production and prices are related, we did so by trying to answer the question of how would producers react if, let's say, prices increase. We discussed that in order to answer this question, we needed to think about, well, what are the producers trying to actually achieve when they're deciding how much to produce? And we figured out that they're trying to maximize profits. So then in order to answer this question, we need to remind ourselves of what profits are. So this is a bit of review. And of course, we remembered from micro that profits are the sales of the firm minus whatever costs they had to incur in order to produce the relevant goods and bring them to market. And then we took one more step, which was to notice that revenue is the price of the output, whatever it is that this company makes, times the quantity, whereas the costs are the quantity of any inputs that the company needed to buy times the price of those inputs. And thus, if we want to figure out how producers react to prices, we need to see where prices show up in their objective function, and we find that they show up actually in two different places. One, the price of the output shows up in the revenue, and two, the price of the inputs shows up in the costs. Why did we end up with this vertical line here for the long run? Because in the long run, as we were discussing, prices will tend to move together. And if prices move together, well, let's say prices double. You've doubled the benefit for production, but you've also doubled the cost. So what's changed by your incentives to produce? Nothing. So you don't change your production. So that was the long run. What about the short run? If in the short run, when prices change, you end up with a different relationship between the price level and output produced, it must be that either these prices don't move when the others move, or these prices don't move when the others move. Right? If they all move together, then we end up with this vertical line. So if there's a distinction between the short run and the long run, it must be that some prices adjust more slowly than others whenever prices in general move. So the question then is there any markets for any particular good, ideally one that's central for all markets, which one could argue responds more slowly to changes in the economy than any other? And I hinted at this last class, but there is a fairly clear answer, I think, and that is the price of labor. So we know, I mean, you've seen that, for example, prices of various things have moved up and down, or moved up a lot lately over the recent months. Let's say we've seen the prices of, you've probably observed the prices of food have been going up, prices of gas have been going up. But did our pay go up together with that, with all those prices? Mine certainly hasn't. My pay is determined every January, so if anything happens during the year regarding prices, my pay doesn't even have a chance to react until next year, based on the way my contract is. So that's the thing. Many labor contracts are written over a certain period of time. actually, when I was hired by GW back in sometime before the Common Era, my contract was actually, first of all, it was offered to me in April, or was it March? Anyway, I wasn't starting until September as a professor. So once I signed, that was set in stone, and I wasn't even working yet. In addition, that contract was a 3-year contract. It said, we're going to pay you such and such, and we'll pay you this for 3 years, and then after 3 years, we'll see. We'll see if you stay with us. We give you an extension, and at that time, we'll also renegotiate. So for 3 years, the price of my labor was basically fixed. And of course, not all labor contracts necessarily have such a long 3-year fixed period, but still, they're generally, as I described, contracts where the price is determined at least for some period, and over that period, it can't really respond. You could say, well, why don't you renegotiate the contract? Well, that's not so easy. If anything changes and let's say prices went up more than expected, I can go to my boss and say, hey boss, I want a raise, and they can say, no, right? Here's the contract, you signed it, I'm not going to do anything until this contract is over. So the labor market has these sort of inherent rigidities built into it. I talked to you about the market for econ professors last week, right? How slow that market is, for example, where if the university wants to hire, then they have to budget for it in, let's say, April of this year. And then people apply in September, October, November of the year. And then they go to the annual meetings and have their first round of interviews in early January. And then if those interviews go well, you get a flyout. They call you up and you go and visit the university that's interviewing you and spend the day there, talking to students, talking to faculty, making presentations, maybe even giving a class. And then they make a decision in February, March, April, and then you start working there the following September. So between the decision to open the position and the person actually starting work, it's over a year. And again, when that person arrives, what do? They sign a contract that probably also lasts several years. So that's how slowly, at least some segments of the labor market react to anything that might change prices or indeed anything else in the economy. The only thing that the university could do over that period, I guess, is something that happened during COVID, which is a lot of universities just said, okay, we're not hiring, we don't have the funds, so just back out. But that's, extreme. So, in practice, in the short run, whenever anything happens that changes prices, let's say, increases the price of output, the price of a key input, the wage, doesn't change, or at least doesn't change by as much. This is often referred to as the idea that wages are sticky. So again, when prices move, the wage doesn't move at all, or at least doesn't move as much. And by the way, notice that what's important here isn't that the input that's getting stuck is the wage itself. What matters is that the thing that's getting stuck, the price that's sticky, is an input price. So when prices change, the marginal benefit from producing, which is the price, has gone up. But your costs have not. So in that case, when prices go up, what should you do if you're a producer? Yeah.
Raise supply.
Raise production, right. You're increasing the benefits, but not increasing the cost, so you should do more of it, whatever it is. An alternative way of seeing this, which should echo something from last week, actually, is the following. Imagine that this is a competitive firm. That's just going to make it easier to see. You may remember from back when you were doing micro that when you analyze the behavior of a producer and how it responded to different changes in prices and costs, you probably did so using something like this figure, where we're representing how marginal cost depends on the production of on the quantity produced. Why does the cost curve slope up? It's because of diminishing marginal returns. Right? The more you make of something, the harder it gets. We draw the price here. And you may recall that according to macroeconomic theory, the best quantity to produce is the one where the price equals the marginal cost. Why? If you produce more, then the cost is greater than what you're getting for those additional units, so it must be eroding your profits. If you produce less, the cost is here for those last units, but the profits are here, so it's profitable to produce more. Still be making some additional profits if you were to do so. So now, into this picture, let's introduce an increase in prices. In addition, because of sticky wages, we don't have an increase in costs. So what should you do? Produce more. So what's that telling us about the aggregate? It's saying that suppose we're at this point here. In the short run, at least for a while, if prices change, the wage is stuck at its old level, or again, alternatively, maybe isn't rising by as much, which gives producers an incentive to produce more than before. In other words, price is up, production up. So what it's telling us is that in the short run, the relationship between the price level and real GDP produced is not vertical. In fact, it's upward sloping. Okay? So the long run all prices move together, so you end up with the vertical long run aggregate supply. Then the short run wages lag, and so if anything happens that changes the price level, we instead get, if the price level rose, we end up with more production. If the price level drops, we end up with less. And it's all because of these sticky wages. Any questions or comments about this? So, now that we've figured out what's the likely shape of the short run aggregate supply, the next thing for us to do is to think about what kind of factors shift the short run aggregate supply. So what can we do there? I can just erase that and write what shifts the short run aggregate supply. First question, do I need to remove these items from this list? Like, are these things that should affect the short run aggregate supply? Yeah, sure, they should, right? If there's an improvement in technology, it improves my ability to produce output both right now and in the short, right? Right now in the short run and in the long run. So before adding to this list, the first thing to have in mind is that anything that affects the long run aggregate supply should affect the short run as well. In other words, the things that make this economy grow so that the long run aggregate supply slowly crawls over to the right. That means the short run supply also is slowly crawling over to the right. Again, making it easy to just sort of abstract from the growth and use this to think about movements around potential GDP. But are there any other things that might shift the short run aggregate supply in addition to these factors? Well, remember that the difference between, to make things simple, the difference between the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply is that in the long run aggregate supply we have the wage moving along with all other prices, but with the short run aggregate supply we do not. And the easiest way to think about it is to say that in the short run we're holding the wages fixed. So what could change that would affect the short run that could not affect the long run? The wages. If and when they get around to catching up with other prices, well, then the short run aggregate supply should move. In what direction? Well, suppose wages go up. Then if wages go up for some reason, for example, because they're finally getting around to catching up with all the other prices, what are you doing? You're increasing the costs and not increasing the revenue. So if wages go up, we are discouraging production. So for any given price level, you would get less. So this shifts that way if wages go up. And similarly, if wages go down, we are making costs lower, so that encourages production. And that makes sense, right? So imagine that we're here, and for some reason, prices rise. First, we'll move somewhere along the supply curve to the right. But then, again, as discussed, if prices rise, the wage lags behind, but sooner or later the wage catch up, which means it rises as well. And what does that do? Well, it would move us back to the long run at this higher price. How? By having this curve shift over to bring us back to the long run. All right, so there's quite a bit going on here. First, we were discussing that the long run prices don't really matter. We discussed in the short run they do because the wage lags behind other prices. But then we saw is, just now, is that implies if the wage lags behind other prices but then eventually catches up, it implies, well, that any deviations from potential GDP should be temporary. Something we'll get back to later. One of the big debates among different economists is about that. Remember, we were just discussing that fluctuations around potential GDP are not fun. They introduce risk and uncertainty into life that we might not like. And of course, underlying the macroeconomic uncertainty, there's a lot of individual uncertainty. Again, if the unemployment rate goes up, it means the risk of unemployment went up. If we're going into a recession, for example. And nobody likes that. Which suggests that maybe there's scope for governments to use whatever tools they have to try and smooth out the business cycle and get us closer to that blue line. Or the Fed, for that matter. But on the other hand, as we just discussed, any deviations from potential GDP must be temporary. So some economists say there's no point in trying to stabilize the economy. It kind of has some built-in stabilization. Any deviation from potential can only be temporary. So there's no need to have any sort of stabilization policy. And what would be the key thing that these different groups of economists would argue about? Like, what is a key thing that makes it more desirable to have some sort of stabilization policy from the government versus not bothering? Well, it all hinges on this. Right? How sticky do you think the wages are? How long are these temporary deviations going to be? Some economists think that a deviation from potential GDP, let's say, I guess it's not so obvious why a deviation above would be a problem, but certainly just having these swings is is undesirable uncertainty, I guess. And certainly any swings down here, any recessions are painful for many people. Some economists think you can end up in a situation like the Great Depression where you're just way below potential GDP for year after year after year after year. And so such things should be avoided at all costs using all possible tools of government that might be available. And something the opposite. They think, no, actually wages are not really that inflexible in reality. There are various ways in which contracts can be adjusted. Or maybe the contracts that are super rigid are rare. And so, yeah, there's really not much scope for governments to try and stabilize stuff. If anything, the only thing governments can do is make matters worse. So this tension between different views, which is of course a disagreement among economists, but then of course that also translates into disagreements among politicians. And then in addition, because of that, these disagreements about theory can become politicized. These are themes that we're going to keep coming back to in what remains of the semester whenever we discuss what governments should or shouldn't do about the business cycle. But again, remember deep down there's this sort of factual disagreement about how the economy works that lies at the heart of this. Right? Any questions, comments, or thoughts? All right, so we're talking about the short-run aggregate supply, and we're talking about things that might shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the question is, are there any other things that I should put on this list that I might want to add as things that might improve the supply curve? Changes in resources, changes in technology, and now we have wages. Well, why is wages here? It's here because it's an input price that we're kind of holding constant when we're defining the short-run aggregate supply curve. But remember, the reason why it moves the supply curve is because the wage is a key input. And when the wage changes, it's changing the costs, not the revenue. So that kind of suggests that any other significant change in input prices could have the same effect. Let's say, what input might be very important to the production of many goods and services other than labor, that you may hear a lot about in the news these days, especially if you're in media. Well, the production and transportation of any goods is going to require energy in some form or another, whether it's from oil or from electricity, and then of course electricity doesn't just come out of thin air. Electricity requires a nuclear power plant or some coal. And so, in principle, a significant spike, or I guess collapse, in the price of any other key inputs could also potentially shift this curve. If it's an increase in prices, it will shift it that way. If it's a decrease in prices, it will shift it this way. Do there exist significant spikes or collapses in input prices? Yeah, they've happened. The probably most notable historical example would be the significant oil price spikes of the 1970s that you may have read about, which the textbook probably talks about. But we are also experiencing some input price spikes these days. I'm told that the price of heating a home in the UK has quadrupled over the past year, for example, because the underlying sources of energy have become more scarce and expensive. Some economists, although there's disagreements about this, argue that, remember I was talking about prices of inputs going up in the 1970s? And some economists argue that another reason for that was an increase in regulation regarding the amounts of pollution that factories were allowed to emit in the United States. That having these new rules put in place meant that the companies that produced electricity mainly in the United States had to install new machinery either to reduce how much pollution they were generating or just tear out the old machinery because they couldn't retrofit it and just put in new machinery from scratch. And that increased the cost of capital, or the cost of electricity for everyone else. So they argue that that was an additional factor, not just the price of oil. So big changes in regulation might force price increases. Makes sense. If I suddenly demand that everyone has to, if I, the government, suddenly force everyone to incur an expense, well, that might increase the prices of doing certain businesses, pursuing certain lines of business. I mention this because you probably know there are various regulations being discussed, or in some places put in place to try and transition to a sort of more environmentally friendly economy, precisely where emissions are controlled, whether it's from vehicles or from electricity generating factories and whatnot. Any of those things are necessarily going to increase costs of some kind or another. And so any of those things are going to, at least temporarily, shift the supply curve to the left at some point, whenever if they're ever widely implemented. Okay. So, what was the point? Well, wages are held constant when we define the short and aggregate supply. So if wages rise, the supply curve shifts left. If they decline, they shift right. So something that we would expect to happen eventually after prices change in one direction or another. But this also suggests that other input prices like oil and energy, and not just them, could also result in shifts in supply. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I guess what I was thinking of saying, I might as well just go ahead, is suppose that you are some economy, and just imagine, let's just say you depend heavily on oil from outside. Then the price of oil spikes, that's going to make your supply curve shift over there. But what if what happened isn't that the price of oil spiked, it's that your currency dramatically lost value? Well, if your currency dramatically lost value, oil is priced in international markets. Suddenly, oil just got very expensive, not for everyone necessarily, but for you, because suddenly your money is no longer worth what it was. So I just mentioned that because sometimes countries have this kind of currency crisis where they lose a lot of value. One of the things that does is it's making their supply curve shift over to the left to the extent that they depend a lot on imports of key inputs. Maybe oil, maybe something else. It's something worth keeping in mind. Any questions, comments, or thoughts about any of this? Yes, then I'm going to take a picture of the board. And this kind of ends our discussion of aggregate supply. So, as you can see, this theory is a theory of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So what we're going to need to do next is put a pin in this while we move to our next discussion, which is what is aggregate demand? What does aggregate demand look like? And by that I mean that we'll go through this exact same exercise. First, we'll have to figure out if there's some aggregate demand curve. What is its shape? In other words, how much you and I demand of final goods and services depend on the price level? And then second, we'll have to go through this other exercise of figuring out what shifts the aggregate demand curve. Now, what we'll see is that discussion is going to take much longer. And in the sense that it won't take us too long to figure out what shape the aggregate demand curve is, and just a hint, it's going to slope down, just like micro demand curve would be. But the list of things that might shift it is going to be really long. And the analysis of some of those factors that might shift the demand curve will require us to go into some depth into understanding the different parts of aggregate demand. So to do that, why don't we erase the board. And I can leave that here. So now we're shifting gears and we're going to discuss the determinants of aggregate demand. Now, how are we going to think about aggregate demand? The way we're going to do this is using some ideas that go back to maybe even the first week of class, maybe I guess the second week of class, because we started on a Wednesday, which was this idea that we're in a macro class, so real GDP is just the sum of all final goods and services produced in a place over a period of time. So when we're measuring GDP, we don't care too much about the details of the goods and services concerned. However, when we think of aggregate demand, we're trying to understand how the price level affects how much goods and services people want to buy. When we're talking about supply, we try to figure that out by understanding what are the motivations of the producers and how they're affected by prices. When we're thinking about aggregate demand, there are different types of goods and different types of demanders, let's say. And so that complicates matters because the factors behind the demand for different kinds of things differ. And we're going to need a comprehensive list. So early in the semester, you'll remember that we said that GDP is broken down into the following parts: consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. Remember this? So the complication is that consumption is things that you and I use up. But investment includes things like this building or an item of machinery in a car factory. And so the incentives that you and I have to buy consumer goods are very different from the incentives that General Motors has to invest in building a new car plant. And that's very different from whatever it is that determines government spending. And that's also different from whatever determines net exports. So we will, when we discuss what are the determinants of aggregate demand, including both the shape of the demand curve and the factors that shift it, we'll need to understand each of these items in detail. And that's why it'll take some time. Right? So that's the plan. To try and understand aggregate demand, we need to spend a lot of time discussing each of these. In some cases, it will take some time. So let's start with consumption. So consumption is purchases or expenditures on consumer goods like this. And so we have to think about what are the determinants of consumption. I find it useful to frame this slightly differently and instead to think about what limits my consumption. I drive a Subaru. I would love to drive to work every day in a Lamborghini, but I don't. Why not?
Because Lamborghinis are expensive.
Because they're expensive, and why would that be a problem? Yeah.
The amount of expensive that they are compared to the Subaru isn't worth the payoff of having a wax Lamborghini versus a Subaru.
But some people have them. How come they do? Yeah.
Higher income.
Right. Exactly. They earn more. So even if I wanted to drive around in a Lamborghini Murcielago, I wouldn't be able to afford it. So consumption is limited by, actually let me leave a space here before I leave a blank. I'm going to write income. Why did I leave a blank? because in a broad brush sense, it's true that my income is a limitation on what I can purchase. But if we use a finer brush, strictly speaking, my income, i.e. what is written on my contract from GW that I'm getting paid every year, itself isn't actually the limitation, because do I get to choose everything that happens with my income? What happens to a bunch of it? Yeah, I have to pay it to Uncle Sam. So it's not exactly my income, it's my income with certain adjustments. The first adjustment is that I need to take out taxes. Yes?
Is it the net income?
This is something that's called disposable income. And I haven't finished defining it, because there's one more adjustment that I have to make. So just as taxes are income that I earned that goes to the government, there may also be some funds the government gives me that aren't my earned income. What do I mean by that? Well, what if I don't have any income because I'm unemployed? I may still, however, get some unemployment benefits from the government in some states, in some countries. Or low-income households with certain characteristics qualify for food stamps. They didn't earn them, but the government gives it to them and allows them to use it to buy goods and services, which is exactly what we're talking about here. Or social security payments to the elderly, which also come from a government fund. So there's a name for all of those funds that people didn't earn, but which they receive from the government. It's sort of like the opposite of taxes. Right? We call those transfers. Disposable income is your income, except that we take out the taxes because you don't get to spend those. And then we add in the transfers because you didn't earn them, but you do get to spend them. So consumption should be limited by disposable income. Now, however, disposable income isn't the only limitation, or I guess source of funds that you might use to determine your consumption. So, whenever I think about this, I remember my time as a graduate student when I got hired by GW, so I think I told you it was in March or April or something. And then I defended my dissertation, and well, it was still April. And GW wasn't going to start paying me until September when I started working here. So what did I do? Well, you could say, well, you could try and work somewhere and get some income, but I couldn't. I was a foreign student, and so I wasn't allowed to work anywhere. So I didn't have any income. So how did I survive from April to September without any income? What did I do? What could I do? Yeah.
You could rely on savings.
I could survive on my savings. I think so I guess maybe we want to be careful about the word savings, because savings could refer to money that I just earned but that I didn't eat. Right? What you mean by savings is savings I previously accumulated, which the text, I believe, also calls wealth. Okay. And notice, if I have any savings or wealth, where did they come from? Well, as we just discussed, it must mean that there's some income, or to be precise, disposable income from the past that I haven't spent yet. So this is based on disposable income from the past. Maybe I should write based on, because it's not the same thing, because some of my disposable income from the past I probably already spent. So, based on, or depends on. That's right, I could have some savings, and then I just consumed my savings for a few months until September, and I started at GW. But I'd just been a graduate student for 5 years. I didn't have any savings. I hope you do. So I didn't have the option of earning income because I was a foreign student. I didn't have any savings or wealth because I just survived 5 years as a graduate student. So what did I do? What else could you do in this situation? Yeah,
Borrow.
borrow. Exactly, I borrowed. You're going to write borrowings because it's the consumer that's the one that's borrowing. Exactly. And I could borrow. Why? Because I just signed a contract to start working at GW. It wasn't starting until September, but I knew that I could rack up some bills over the summer. And then as soon as I started at GW, bam, pay them off. In other words, what is my ability to borrow based on? Yeah.
Future income.
Exactly, my disposable income in the future. So, it is true that my ability to consume is limited by my consumption, but I'm not just drawing on my current income in order to consume. I can also draw on any savings that I might have, and I can also borrow against my future income. So what is my current income mixed together with all my past income, mixed together with all my, and I guess I should add the word expected future income here, because of course we don't know for sure what the future holds. In my case, it was pretty clear because I had a contract in hand that I was going to start at W. But in general, you know, the future is somewhat uncertain. So, if I add all this together, what is it? This is my lifetime income. Or I guess lifetime disposable income, if you want to be careful. So, this gives us a powerful observation, which is that my consumption today may not depend too much on circumstances today, because they also depend on my future income, my past income. This is what's known as the lifetime income hypothesis. Aggregate demand depends on all these things, and consumption is about 2/3 of GDP, so it's by far the biggest. But in general, it doesn't move around very much. In other words, when the business cycle is going up or down, consumption isn't the one typically doing much of the moving, even though it's by far the largest piece of GDP. And this is one potential explanation for why. It's just that your ability to consume is not limited by what's going on right now. It depends on, because you can just spend out of your savings or spend out of your, or borrow against the future. Notice this is true only under certain assumption. it assumes that you're able to access your savings from the past. And it assumes that you're able to borrow against your future income. So what is there that stands between you and your ability to, let's say, borrow against your future income? Yeah.
The robustness of the banking system.
Right, the financial system is there. It requires your ability. This lifetime income hypothesis could be a very powerful idea explaining why consumption doesn't move, unless there's something wrong with the banking system, which I'm underlining to again indicate how potentially severe banking system problems can be. Then, if the economy is growing or shrinking a little slowly, oh well, we can sort of handle that to some extent by using our savings or by borrowing. But if the banking system is messed up, you can't do that. And then you could get a severe economic collapse, like in the Great Depression, like in 2008. COVID was a bit weird, right? Because the problem there was suddenly everyone stayed home. That's obviously not a normal recession. It's also not a normal financial crisis either. But the point is that suggests that the key thing supporting consumption is actually hiding in the background here, but it's the health of the financial system. Let's see. How are we doing for time? I think we have 10 minutes. And I don't think we have enough here to, well, I guess we can see the following. We still haven't figured out if this tells us about the shape of the demand curve. It's going too soon. Sorry, my alarm's going off. We still don't have enough here to figure out what's the shape of the demand curve. We'll get to that on Wednesday. But we do have here an interesting list of things that probably shift the demand curve. Here's one. Taxes. If you increase taxes, what do? You're reducing disposable income. So chances are you're reducing consumption and aggregate demand. What about transfers? If you increase transfers, it increases disposable income, it probably increases aggregate demand. Why is this interesting? These two things are under the control of the government. It's suggesting the government can control aggregate demand. What else? Well, anything that somehow severely affects the value of your savings or your wealth, or as discussed, your ability to access them, could move aggregate demand. Anything that affects our ability to borrow, again, financial system stability could matter as well. Then there's one more thing that I haven't written here, which I guess is why we'll have to come back to this on Wednesday. And that is, the banking system does two things. One, it allows me to access my future income by borrowing, but it doesn't do so for free, right? If you borrow, well, you have to pay interest. So this suggests maybe interest rates could also matter. So you see how we just thought about consumption, we thought about what limits it or determines it in a very general sense. And we already came up with a pretty long list of things that could shift the demand curve around. Actually, there's even one more. Remember, my ability to borrow depends on my expected future income. What if information changes that changes what you believe future income is going to be? That could shift your consumption today, even though that change hasn't happened yet. So all of these things will, so next class what we'll do is we'll compile all of these things into one big list, and then we'll also try and leverage them to think about what the shape of the aggregate demand curve is. In the meantime, we can wrap up our final few minutes with a little exit quiz. First question. What is on the y-axis in this figure? naming these axes when you fall asleep. It's the price level. Very good. The long run aggregate supply curve can shift to the right if what happens? Prices rise, prices decline, technology improves, or technology declines. To the right if technology improves. Very good. The short run aggregate supply slopes downwards. True or false? Is of course false. It slopes upwards. Almost there. The short run aggregate supply slopes up because what? Wages adjust faster than other prices, slower than other prices, together with other prices, or are highly flexible. Remember, wages are sticky. They adjust slower than other prices. Which of these shifts the short-run aggregate supply to the right? And of course the answer is a decrease in wages, which encourages production. And last of all, which of these shifts the short run aggregate supply to the left? And the answer is an increase in the oil price. All right, let's see how we did. Thank you very much. Hope that was a useful quiz. Nicholas was third. Good job. SI is second. And first is Yamorant Insta. All right, Yamorant Insta, please come up. I have a little something for you. Everyone else, thanks for coming. Talk to you soon.